Welcome to the Queer Stories of Recovery, Voices from the Margin podcast. In Season 1, Episode 2, Doctor, Danny B explores how alcohol use disorder is recognized as a disability, but academia still clings to old, ableist traditions celebrating overwork, exhaustion, and alcohol-centered networking as if they're badges of honor. With guest participant Dee, who is a genderqueer sociology scholar and adjunct from a Midwest Catholic university, who together share how academic culture erases the lived realities of disability and pushes out those at the intersections of queerness, sobriety, and scholarship. For queer, sober academics, the message often feels stark. Either conform to systems that harm you or risk being shut out of the very spaces where your presence and voice are most needed. Dee, currently ABD as a doctoral candidate, chose their original PhD program in New Orleans because, as she says, like every good alcoholic does, Doctor. Danny is so excited to chat with Dee, who is also a feminist theorist and queer scholar, and to reconnect with someone she met who too was in their drinking days. Too often, academia imagines itself in the glow of the scholar's pub or the intellectual happy hour, a vision built on white, middle, and upper-class norms of leisure. The message is clear. If you want to belong in intellectual life, you'd better join the ritual of drinking. But what happens when sobriety is survival? What happens when alcohol has been a weapon of harm through colonial regimes, through intergenerational trauma, through ableist systems that still haunt our institutions? This podcast episode is all about how Dr. Danny and Dee challenge those norms and center their voices as queer, sober academics as they work to carve out other ways to create community.
Hey there, everyone. Welcome to Queer Stories of Recovery, Voices from the Margin. You know, this podcast is a space where recovery isn't just about surviving, but about queering the very frameworks that were never built for us in the first place. And we're going to talk about those frameworks in just a minute. As some of you know, and as I mentioned in my last episode, which was the first episode, this podcast grew out of what once was a Whisper of Resistance. It is a reboot of the Voices from Rock Bottom podcast, but it's doing something a little bit different, which I believe is deeply necessary, right? So I've said this whisper has become a chorus now. It's unapologetically loud. It echoes across recovery circles. It's challenging the spaces like classrooms and institutional communities that have too often erased queer folks. So just so you know, on Queer Stories of Recovery, queerness is not an afterthought. It is a starting point. We're not only queering recovery, we're queering academia, we're queering storytelling, we're queering addiction recovery, and we're queering the ways we imagine healing. And because we are sober academics, our stories at times might be messy, complicated, and maybe a little defiant. But, you know, we're going to share our survival strategies, our acts of resistance, and I always believe at the end of the day, these conversations offer a vision of possibility. So when I say queer stories are that whisper of resistance turned all the way up, I mean no more hiding, no more asking for permission. This is where truth gets amplified, where recovery and queerness converge, and where our voices from the margin, take center stage. So I'm very excited. Episode 2. Today our guest is Dee. Dee is genderqueer. They are 2.5 years sober. They refer to themselves as the queer PhD dropout who chose their PhD program in New Orleans, as Dee says, every good alcoholic does. They took a break from teaching while getting sober, and currently they teach sociology, and are a feminist and queer theorist at a very small Catholic institution in the Midwest. Woo. That's quite a little bit of an intro. Very exciting. So, Dee, can you start by telling us a little bit more about yourself and your journey that brought you to recovery?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks so much for having me. That was just such an exciting intro. I love the way that you do your work in the world and show up. And, we've known each other for a while, but getting to see you kind of just in this space you've been a real possibility model for me, I just want to say. So like, I'm very grateful for everything that you do. You're so cool. But yeah, so honestly, like I would say that like you and other people like you and seeing you guys be open about your sobriety, not related to academia, just in general, was one of the things that kind of got me, to the point of deciding I needed to stop drinking. Um, when I look back, I tried to stop like many times here and there, but I also just kept making very alcoholic choices. Like I said, going to a PhD program in New Orleans, um, and just making decisions based on what would kind of give me the time to be in charge of my own time, which as an alcoholic and neurodivergent person is not a great thing. So, yeah, I finally got sober 2.5 years ago because I was really struggling finishing my PhD. I was ABD. I had done my research while wasted, like just very, very, like through the pandemic in New Orleans, deep in my alcoholism. And by the time I was like writing it up, I was reading all of my like notes and things, and I really just truly had no idea what I was talking about. Like I did not remember, like it just, I felt very far removed from it. And I tried to think of what was in my control that I could change. So first I changed my environment and went back home to Jersey. And then I realized that, I could stop drinking and see if maybe that helped with anything in my life. And so I made that choice the day after the Super Bowl, you know, whatever, in 2023. And it was the day before Valentine's Day. And it just felt like it felt like a really nice act of self-love, honestly. And I, so far, have not relapsed, even though that's a possibility for all of us. But yeah.
Thank you for sharing that and sharing your intro and giving us a little bit of a nice picture. For those of us who are out there who are academics or teachers who don't have to be in higher ed, that whole pandemic pedagogy was killer. We're trying to reach out to students and keep them motivated through learning and education. And we're also struggling on the other side of the screen because everybody, right? The world was completely uncertain. And if you weren't sober already, you're definitely like working your way towards sobriety, right? So like, yeah. So, and like, listen, here's the deal. Let's talk a little bit about the insides of, a PhD program.
Yeah.
I've always known you to be very, very smart. So I know Dee through my cousin. I remember when you were in undergrad. So to see you come this way, like first of all, I'm like, yeah, you have a PhD. But also, I'm like super proud, and I'm so glad that we stayed connected. But you mentioned about I did my research while wasted, and I think if you're thinking about like your PhD program and your recovery, like side by side, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Um, I mean, just like impetus is a word that comes to my mind because even though I've definitely been an alcoholic my whole life and binge drinking, was always a problem for me. It was not, yeah, until I was in the PhD program where, I'm being funded, not tons of money, but getting paid to be a student, right? And to teach a couple of classes. And then, like I said, very much in charge of my time. I'm in New Orleans where, you can hide in plain sight. I mean, everybody is drunk all the time. And then as you talk about, academia is an alcoholic environment as well. And so, like everything around me just kind of allowed me to kind of get to, a rock bottom. I would say that I've definitely, I don't feel as though there's like one rock bottom. I think I've had many. And then like my final drunk on Super Bowl day, 2023 was not even anything particularly, you know, crazy. Definitely not in the grand scheme of my life. But it was just it. Like it was really just, that final straw. But yeah, I mean, doing a PhD program and feeling like I didn't necessarily have the support that I needed, the structure that I needed, the actual like engagement with other humans as much as I needed. Like it was so, in my head and individual and like the idea that we all have to produce something new because we all have to brand ourselves instead of just like this collaborative, putting together like work in a more collaborative way. It was just really killer for me. And I, yeah, just drank more, than I ever had in my life. And I had a ton of health problems from it, had multiple seizures that I didn't realize or that I wouldn't admit to myself, were related to my drinking until later. But yeah, just got, like I said, to this place where that made me realize that's something that was within my control, even though, again, I hadn't done any 12-step work yet. So, like, I'm not thinking about the serenity prayer in, like, whatever, like, actually as a thing. But I was definitely like, what is something that I can change, because I don't understand, as many of us feel, I don't understand why everything's going wrong and what's happening in my life. And deciding to cut out alcohol made a lot of those things clear, and, more will be revealed and is revealed every single day.
Yeah, I mean, when you were just sharing, my brain was on fire. Um, you know, you talked about branding, right? Like in branding yourself. I think it's so funny because there's also a sense of that in academia as well, right? Let's call it what it is. It's ego, right?
Yeah.
It's ego. We hear in recovery the ego is very bad, right? Easing, the goodness out, easing God out, right? All those other little acronyms, okay? And then in academia, ego, reputation, status. If you're doing, and producing, you're going to continue to rise on that, like, or elevate yourself on that hierarchy. And there are many challenges, right? There's bureaucratic challenges, there's institutional challenges.
Yeah.
We can't unpack that right yet. We'll save that for the middle part of the podcast. But I did like how you were talking about, like, oh, but you were craving scholarly community. You were craving community with others,
Mm-hmm.
especially in recovery. Because, like, we're community-based people as academics and as sober
Yeah.
persons. But you did talk a little bit about New Orleans, and I never say it correctly. Did I say it
I
right?
mean, I don't either as a Jersey. No, yeah, New Orleans, New Orleans.
Well, my friend is Cajun, and she's from Louisiana,
Okay.
and she's always schooling
Yeah.
me, and I hope she watches this episode because she's gonna be like, we talked about this, all right? So, anyways, Nola. Um, so it's very interesting that they always say you pull a geographic before you get sober. So it's no surprise that you choose Nola
Yeah.
to be the stomping ground, right? Like, think about
Uh-huh.
it. Your stomping ground.
Uh-huh.
You get sober, like, that's it. You had your rock bottom on the Super Bowl. It was like touchdown, rock bottom at the same time.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I love it. I love when people like have these like really like kind of corny moments, right, of sobriety, which
For
is like,
sure.
oh God, I'll never forget it because I got sober on New Year's Eve,
Right.
right? It's just one of those other moments. But it's interesting because, you know, historically in the United States, New Orleans is one of the most alcoholic cities, and it is a place where alcohol flows, not just in bars, but like I even think, of communities like, as my friend was saying, in the bayou, in working class bars, right? In the
Mm-hmm.
everyday life. And so, there's open container laws where you can carry a
Mm-hmm.
drink down Bourbon Street, and there are like drive-through daiquiri shops
Yeah.
where you could drive and get daiquiris.
Yeah.
Like, so there is a very blurry line between like convenience and excess. And I think like to sort of like, all right, I'm at the peak of my alcoholism. I'm going to do a PhD program. This city's landscape is going to normalize drinking at every single turn. This is a really
Mm-hmm.
good place for me to hide out. And so, but another thing it really like makes me think about, I don't know if you've maybe thought about it a little bit more, is especially like the celebration of alcohol as being inseparable from the academic institution, especially you trying to get your PhD there,
Yeah.
right? So, alcohol again is not just a substance, but it is also a cultural
Yeah.
institution. So you're within a cultural institution, within another cultural institution. So, talk to me a little bit more about that, if you can.
Okay, so first I have to say, because you just reminded me of like this hilarious slash ridiculous way that I started the program. Like, this is how everybody met me. So we had our opening like dinner at the chair of my program's, house. It's an interdisciplinary PhD program. We have sociologists, social workers, and like urban studies, PhDs. And so it's a potluck, we all bring something. So I decided to bring sangria because I love making sangria, right? And I make my sangria with tequila in it, because of course I do. And so I made this white wine sangria that was so strong, but I really did not even realize like how strong it was, or that people who drink a lot but not like me might react to that. And I got people like unintentionally wasted, and I just remember like I don't know, like I remember realizing it as I was there, and then also just getting wasted myself. And like that was my first, interaction with like most of the people in positions of power in my program and with my peers. And, it just like it didn't seem like I remember realizing, like I said, like, oh shit, like that might be a little stronger than I like realized, but also not feeling any kind of like shame or worried about that. And I think that had a lot to do with like being in New Orleans. We're all, we're all here, so we must all like to drink. Um,
It's interesting because the first guest, in the previous episode, is from Louisiana and teaches there, and like really has talked a lot about like, you know, trudging through academia, like with eyes down, looking at the floor, like not being able, like just trying to like survive. And it's interesting because like we have to maintain a certain professionalism, but then like there are these like end of semester gatherings or like graduation ceremonies, and there's always like the wine and the cheese, especially if it's the humanities or the social sciences.
yeah,
And so I think like that moment where you're talking about spiking the fruit bowl, right, the fruit punch bowl, the punch bowl, okay, theoretically speaking, is like kind of like a way that you were like coming out as somebody who's struggling with alcoholism, right?
yeah.
And so I would say like that probably might not have been like a one-time event, but it think tell me a little bit more about what it's been like to sort of come out in academia now sober,
Yeah.
with like thinking about that where you were
Mm,
previously.
yeah. I'm not so like my current institution. I've been here since last year. I adjunct, and I kind of interact with like one, you know, full employee here. Um, but as far as just like how I approach academia differently, um, I think that I don't know. I don't know if that's exactly the question. Maybe actually, maybe can you rephrase the yeah.
No, perfect. So basically, like, can you share a moment of like an act of like coming out now in sobriety in academia after having like unintentionally come out as like, because you know people always say like, you know, the alcoholic or the person struggling with substance abuse is the last one to come to that
Right.
realization. Everybody around them knows,
Yeah.
right? So I'm trying to see like what has been the experience of like that being seen as somebody who's sober in academia, like has like a sort of way of like coming out. Like has that felt heavy? Has it felt liberating? Do they know? Do they
Right.
not know? Because
Right.
you know, your last experience before sobriety, you know, getting everybody shit faced as your first impression
Yeah.
into the department,
Yeah.
you know, it's something that, you know, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
and
you,
no, thank you for clarifying all that. I mean, yeah, so I ended up, so when I got sober, it was with the intention of finishing my PhD, and I had a great advisor who, I was very open with, like throughout the PhD program. I institutionalized myself in a trauma ward in New Orleans in 2019, and I talk about that, in recovery all the time because I really didn't think that rehab was like accessible to me because we all have that idea of what like a really bad or real alcoholic is. And so I literally like I knew I had PTSD, that was diagnosed. I had had two seizures, like I said, but I truly thought that they were like psycho seizures. I really, you know what I mean? Like I just thought that my PTSD was really bad. And I was like, I need to be put away because even to myself, the amount I was drinking was too much. And I was thinking of it as like, okay, if I lock myself away in here, which is the last thing I ever, like, I am not, you know, not an authority, a lover of authority, really not interested in being kept anywhere by anyone. But that seemed like the best and safest option, for me to kind of just be removed from alcohol. And yet, like I said, I didn't think about it as like me specifically having a problem with alcohol. I thought of it just as like a effect, of my PTSD. But at that point, I was supposed to be TAing for my advisor that semester, and I had to miss the first couple weeks of school. And I just remember like that was when I first kind of opened up to her more about like the substance use aspect of my trauma. And she was really, really supportive, but also, she has her own stuff going on. And there's just, there were ways in which like I didn't necessarily feel like I could lean on her about this or like that she understood, I didn't really feel like I had anyone who was in the same position as me. But so that was kind of like the first time. And then when I ended up, dropping the program, I was in communication with the university. It was somebody at the university. I'm totally blanking on who, probably the dean. But I remember just kind of thinking about how to word what I needed to say, because I don't know, I didn't want it to sound like I got sober and I think if I finish this that I will not be sober. But that was how I was feeling. But it also just seemed like an excuse to give to some, you know what I mean? Like it felt like not real still, you know what I mean? So I remember just kind of being like, yeah, I've had a lot of trouble in the program and I also am in recovery and I really need to be like focused on that. And if there is this time limit on me finishing, I don't think, that is going to be possible. And it was, I don't know, it was liberating and, sad at the same time. And I don't know, it was pretty complicated. And I think I'm probably, as I hear myself talk about it now, like still kind of working out what I feel about that and, what it means to me.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that this is a really nice place for us to sort of like segue like into a little bit more about being like queer and sober in academia in the Midwest in a Catholic institution. Like how do you sustain your authenticity?
Yeah.
Like, because here's the thing, whether or not you are an out queer adjunct faculty member, like I'm an out queer faculty member,
Yeah.
but like I'm also cognizant of the space in which I'm teaching, which is a public university in New Jersey.
Right.
But here you are, you have all of these different cultural contexts surrounding your body. And as queer people, we know that our bodies are constantly read.
Yeah.
So I guess like I would say like how do you sustain that your authenticity without feeling exhausting or unsafe as a queer sober academic?
Great question. I'm on campus right now, and you and I both have our like flagging haircuts, right? We've got our little side cuts. I'm wearing my Jersey leopard blazer. But I would say, yeah, I show up in class as my full self, and now that I'm sober, I'm a lot better at making sure that I'm also just like making space for everybody. I think that in the past I probably was not as considerate of, or I think that I was like feeling as though I was being judged or like ready, just like we are when we're like in it, like, paranoid and feeling like people are like looking at you constantly, even though yes, like our bodies are constantly under scrutiny. But I think I just, not that I tried to hide before, but I didn't really like care. And now I feel like I'm more intentional about the ways in which, I'm out on campus. But I'm out with all my students. I tell them that I use all pronouns. It's an intro to social class that I mainly teach. And so at the beginning of the semester, like we're talking about, race and gender and sexuality and things. And so just as I ask them to also, as we put on the sociological imagination, I, give my own examples of how like the personal and political and academic just always, are intertwined. I make sure that I incorporate content that kind of highlights, queerness and, queer culture and people, like even just for like everyday examples that I'm using in the classroom. I went to high school with Tyler Clementi, and so, I grew up in literally the same exact environment that he did, and I remember like exactly where I was in undergrad when they found his body, like when they pulled him out of the George Washington. And I had this teacher who was a straight woman who taught like our how to teach writing and reading, classes or whatever, because I used to be a high school teacher. And she had created like such a safe and beautiful space by kind of doing the same, right? Where it's like, okay, we're not just going to incorporate queerness during October or during June, right? Like she had made a space where I was able to just walk in there and just like sob and, have this thing where we were kind of all like processing and holding space for, this horrific thing that had happened together. And so, yeah, I mean, I try very much to do that. I also use like Tyler as an example, in my classroom. And yeah, when students ask me, because I've had students, come up to me and check in about pronouns or, ask me about being queer here, a few young women who like had never met a lesbian or a queer person until they came to this university, right? And yeah, even when I taught high school, I try to just be very open with my students and honest about, who I am. And I don't know, I think it's important, especially for kids who have certain ideas about queer people because they think they've never met them in their lives, to just know people that are technically in a position of power above them, but are enacting power as like this circuit, where it's not like I'm not a top-down teacher. I mean, you said like I'm very into like critical pedagogy. My master's research was on like out high school teachers in the classroom who were critical pedagogues and like what it looked like, for them to kind of like incorporate those things in their lives. So yeah, I think today I had a student walk out of class because we were talking about feminism. And so my example that I brought up was the huge debate last week on the internet about whether feminism is dead, because at his memorial service, Charlie Kirk's wife, right, said, things that align with her general views, including that feminism is like this scourge, right? And meanwhile, like she has multiple degrees. She's one of the 10% of women CEOs in the world. She has all of these things that she got as a direct result of feminism. And I had, one of my young women who already kind of like is disengaged and giving me that like look every class. She just got up and walked out during it. So, and then I've had students write course evals that I do not have Catholic values, that I don't align with the values of the university as well. So
Okay, let me start. We have a lot to go there. Yeah, I worked at a Greek Orthodox parochial school in Brooklyn before I jumped into my PhD. And I applied to the PhD program because I was angry and resentful after I had an encounter. I mean, in the first early years of working there, I was outed by a student who had like her sister's friend like was somebody I used to work with. So not only was I outed, and when I started this job, I was newly sober. So not only was I outed as a lesbian, I was outed as a party girl, even though I was newly sober. Like the first couple of months I started that job. And that student was suspended. But from that moment, the institution was finding every which way to boot me because I, in their words, was not a model Christian woman. And I'm like, I don't know about you, but like I went to Catholic school my whole life. I was an altar server, Eucharistic minister, elector. Like, let's not like go there.
Right.
I went to Catholic college, Catholic university, like, and and ironically, I applied to that Catholic university again to get my PhD, right? Because I had one professor who looked me in the eye, and I knew that she saw me, and I went back, and she, anyways,
Yeah.
so But I think it's like so important that you talked about that, because I've also had course evaluations where like students told me I had a gay agenda.
Mhm.
And like when you're teaching a class of creative nonfiction essays during 2016, it's rough. Like 2020, it's rough, right? So, and we know like sociology, we know feminism, the personal is political. Like we know that the personal is political. And you're right, everything that, you know, Erica Kirk is capable of today because of feminism, right? But nobody wants to talk about that. And that entire philosophy even bleeds through the spaces of recovery and the spaces of academia. Before I push my next question onto you, like I do want to mention that my heart sank a little bit when you talked about Tyler Clementi. And for those who don't know, like a little bit more about the story, like he was a gay Rutgers University first year student who died by suicide because his roommate was using a webcam to spy on him as he was having an intimate encounter with another man. And it really like sparked like an entirely national discussion about privacy of queer folks, and even it's a form of cyberbullying, and harassment. But sadly, having been outed in that way, and especially because not only was it recorded, but I mean,
He broadcast
his
it.
he broadcast it, right? He broadcasted the entire encounter online, and and it was horrible. But and sad. Clementi, like Tyler, took his life. And I mean, and that just shows you the sort of like degrading level of invasion of privacy
Mhm.
that not only are queer bodies being read, but queer bodies are also intimidated by homophobic bias and transphobia, and we can go on and on
Oh
and that.
yeah,
And
for sure.
and I think like pointing attention to that particular moment, not only as like a national moment, but even just at a personal moment, because you knew Tyler, like I think that kind of helps me to go to the next question, which is like you talked a little bit about some of the strategies about being out, being queer, and in both academia and recovery. But how, like in the world now, right, in 2025, like how do you create space for queer joy, right, queer resistance in environments that were not particularly built for you, right?
Yeah.
Like, because here's the deal, like 12-step recovery is not, I mean, like there are some update surveys that like show a little bit more of the updated membership, but
Yeah.
this is an institution that was male
Right.
centric, and created by middle class elite white men.
Hmm.
And you know I mean, there is some like real resistance to
Yeah.
change within the institution, and then the same thing with academia as well. The drinking gentleman. Let's not disrupt that.
Yeah.
So, how do you continue to like coming out of like being out, being loud, being like an activist? How do you find time, or what are the ways that you create that kind of queer space?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, and I'll elaborate, but it's like very, again, kind of serenity prayer adjacent, where it's like I feel like I've gotten good at kind of like picking the parts of institutions that like either do work or that I can work if I work it, and kind of like making, like seeing where there's opportunity for me to kind of get in there, right? And then also knowing the things that I just won't engage with on campus or in general with the institution. And I think that's part of why I like adjuncting. Like I've never wanted to, even when I was still in the PhD program, I didn't want to be like a tenure track professor personally, even though obviously adjunct pay is crap. I like doing that alongside other jobs because um, it allows me to kind of like disengage and not have to, be part of aspects of the institution that I don't want to. And then also, I did a lot of like grassroots work when I was younger, and I still do, but I think I used to like not want to interact with the people that I kept being told I needed to interact with. Like I would be in like, spaces working on like racial justice in education. I was part of like NICOR, like the New York Coalition of Radical Educators, right? And like NJ Tag, like teacher activist group and stuff. Um, and this is like pre Black Lives Matter, like really getting deep in the conversations around intersectionality that happen now. But, I was told that like it would be very useful for me to be teaching young, privileged white students, like because of my own, privilege and social location and things like that. And having like come from that environment, I wanted nothing to do with that, right? And I it took me a while to kind of realize that like there is a huge um, just a huge benefit, and like that I can really be grateful for the opportunity to kind of be around young people who might see me as someone that they can relate to around certain, identity factors, and then kind of like break it down for them, like kind of, I don't know, I'm not saying it that well. Also, you're frozen, so I hope I'm not frozen too.
No, I was just listening. I was deep in thought. Sometimes it's ironic because I talk with my whole body, but like when I'm listening, I
You were a
freeze.
statue, yeah, literally.
Yes, I was in statue mode. Yeah, I mean, what? I'm glad you talked about privilege and power and and dominion. We have to like, I don't know. I think this is a really good place, right, for this because I love teaching and I love teaching as an adjunct. I, of course, would like a full time job with full time pay. And the job market is brutal because of the current state of political affairs. Let's be real. And it's always been a little tough, but it's especially tough now because, we know what's out there and we know what's happening. But I think, like every time I fill out a job application, I think of that moment where it says, do you identify as somebody having a disability? And, for those who don't know, like alcoholism addiction, or currently termed as AUD, which is alcohol use disorder, is recognized as a disability. But like, let's be real. If I'm applying to a job, right, I always pause because I'm like, well, yeah, I have a disability, AUD. Let's talk about embodiment. That's a whole conversation.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm also trying to get a job in an institution that clings to deeply ableist precedents that reward overwork, that reward exhaustion, that reward burnout, and alcohol-centered like networking as a sign of success. Yeah. So I don't click that box because I'm very aware that the culture not only erases this idea of like the actual realities of disability, but it does marginalize those who live also at the intersections of queerness, right? And sobriety and scholarship. Yeah. So, on the one hand, I'm being invited to be the graduate speaker for, like doctoral, like graduate commencement.
Love that.
But still the message is clear, right? Yeah. Like either you assimilate into the system that harms you, or you risk exclusion from the very space where your voice and presence are needed most. Right. So how do you navigate that, right? Like this denial of legitimacy of disability while celebrating practices that can be profoundly damaging to a person who, yes, is in long-term addiction, long-term sobriety, long-term recovery, but you're still living with the disease, right? You're still living with ADD.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I guess when I am filling things out like that, I've never thought about that as far as like, will I mark this for disability or not in relation? Like, I think about that in relation to, some other things that sorry, that was my laptop squeaking across the table. Take that out. I think that, okay, while you were talking, I kind of like went in a different direction because you made me realize something else that I wanted to share, and it is still related, but I totally forgot that like when I applied for this job, like my CV is, as most academic CVs are, kind of like all over the place, right? Because when you're in a PhD program for years, it looks, and especially if you don't finish, right, then it's kind of like, okay, what is my CV supposed to say? Where am I supposed to kind of like, hint at things or kind of like fill in for people so that they don't fill it in with their own, imagination and whatever. But I did this like women's empowerment workshop locally, and they kind of helped me put together my CV in general, like not specific to this institution. And I mean, a lot of my work outside of academia has been around like LGBTQ. You know, like I worked at GLAAD for a minute. Like when I worked for a congresswoman in 2017, I worked on like women's and LGBT issues. My, you know, master's like thesis, which is like my one academic publication, right? Like in a book about Paulo Freire, is, like I said, literally about um, out queer teachers. It's like living in the contradictions, you know? Um, and I just am very open in the CV. Like it's, you know, about who I am. And my experience is so diverse. Like it's like I worked in politics. I did this over here, you know, all these different things. And I was worried that that would be received as like a negative, you know? Um, but again, I was like throwing it at all these universities here and seeing what stuck as far as like adjuncting. And so I wasn't really like, oh, I need to get a job at this particular Midwestern Catholic university. This is my only option. So I didn't change anything. And when the head of the department reached out to me, he literally, like when I came in to interview with him, said that my CV was why, you know, he wanted me here. And so he is like a straight, you know, Midwestern man who teaches psychology, and is super lovely and like, you know, saw me and saw that there is a need for somebody like me in a space like this, you know, and like made sure that I knew that all of that was something that was actually like a strength rather than a deficit. And I think for it to be framed that way, you know, especially like here and, you know, for someone who wasn't also queer was great. You know, I'm not saying it was like validating more than if it came from somebody else, but it just did kind of like help me feel more confident about like being overall out, you know, on campus and things like that. Um, yeah. Did that also sort of answer your question?
No, that absolutely did, because it really like sort of sparked a thought in my mind. You know, like it's interesting to like be seen and to be needed. Want like to have our knowledge, our life experience, and our scholarship like validated, right? In spaces that we would never think that it would be
Yeah.
validated. And it doesn't mean that it's like it's necessary for it to be validated, but you know, it's still kind of murky, because even those institutions, while there are people with, right, like people are like, oh, if you want to change an institution, you got to change it from the inside out. And I'm like, that's not always like, I mean, yes, so true, but that's also called exploitative labor.
Right.
Let's not even talk about labor issues,
Yeah.
right? Like, and then you have like Kirk's list of professors, dangerous professors. So okay, you want us to exploit labor, right? And then you have stuff like that, and you have academia being completely like tarnished and shunned because free thought and education is dangerous, right? And so, and now we could see that academia is like trying to keep its head above water and to survive amidst the political climate, but you know, still like belonging to those old rules. Like not really like, oh, we're gonna resist, we're gonna fight, but there's a lot of institutions that are like, let's just keep our heads low.
Yeah.
And I think what I don't know when it started, right? Like I don't know if it was like within the last couple of years, because I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about AUD as a disability. I'm thinking about academia and how it kind of like codes belonging to these like late nights of studying, these happy hours, these potentially dangerous situations where there could be sexual violence or harassment, like this idea of clout built over drinks.
Hmm.
And I'm like, I live in Jersey now, but I'm a New Yorker through and through. And I've learned that Manhattan has this like new kind of wave. Like first of all, they have sober bars now, which is like I think is
Yeah.
great. But I still think for me, like personally, as somebody who's sober for a few 24
Right.
hours, is like I don't know, it's a little too close for me. You know what I mean? Like that's a little. I think it's good for people who could do it. Like I would never drink a
Right.
non-alcoholic beer. That's my personal
Right.
choice. But so there is a new wave of like social consciousness of people making like better, healthier choices
Yeah.
for themselves. But there's also still that like really deeply dangerous history to the lecture, or this idea of lecture. And I don't know if you've seen it. It's like a bar-based lecture series, and it's called Lectures on Tap. And basically, what it does is that a professor, like it's almost like a TED Talk over beer,
Right.
right?
Right.
A professor is inside of a bar, and it's people are like invited citywide. It's open to everybody. Like I think you can find it in like Secret New York City, or even if you look up lectures on tap,
Uh-huh.
they're like submit your like, your idea, so you can like do a lecture, and you could do a PowerPoint with a lecture in a cozy, intimate bar in Manhattan.
Right.
And so it's like packaging learning and education with alcohol,
Yeah.
as like sort of like a default like solvent.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like, when I'm thinking about academia and coming out as a sober person, like, learning how to be social in this sort of space, and learning how to like to find my scholarly voice, to find the confidence to like be in that space. And then you have like, you're in a sort of framing that's not neutral, like it's
Hmm.
exclusionary, right? Like, and then you have lectures on tap. So I for me, it's like, it's this like constant recycling of ableist assumptions, right?
Yeah.
Like what community around knowledge and information is supposed to look like. So I think like, you know I don't know, like how. I mean, what are your opinions on like this idea of like a public lecture requiring a bar, and how you could see that being connected to that sort of history?
Yeah. I mean, that's like both wild and also just like so expected. And it's funny because as you were saying that, I was thinking just about how we think of alcohol as this thing that kind of like, white men on golf courses. It's like, this is how like deals happen. And this is how not only we like network, but yeah, like that alcohol kind of like smooths and paves the way for things to be like, you know, more collaborative or whatever else, when in reality, obviously, it causes so many issues, even for non alcoholics, right? But I was thinking, like, my students and I were talking the other day. Um, they're young and they don't remember, they were very young when Trayvon Martin was killed. And then, like, soon after that, or no, actually, it was before that, I think, Henry Louis Gates, right, like, gets, like, roughhoused at his home. He's this, like, in Boston. Um, he's, like, a distinguished Ivy League professor, right? And he's trying to get into his house in the middle of the day, black man in his, like, 60s. And someone called the cops on him. And so then it sparked that whole like post-racial society, kind of debate. And Obama had Henry Louis Gates and the cop that roughed him up over to the White House, and they sat on the White House lawn. And what did they do? They shared like a Bud Light or a Corona. I mean, I don't even know if it was Bud Light, but like they had a beer on the White House lawn. And, that shows us that we live in a post-racial society, right? So just like the way in which it is seen as this thing that kind of like allows for so much positive when, in reality, it's very much the opposite. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that I can't think of a single like academic event that I've been to that wasn't like a, lecture for students like during the day that didn't have like alcohol as part of its whatever reception. And I remember organizing like our symposiums where at Tulane, and just like being so excited about how much wine we could get for this budget at Costco, and then knowing that there would be some left over at the end, and that we'd be taking those bottles, and like we kept a stash of wine in like the hall closet, right? Like middle, like just the hallway closet of the second floor, of one of the main buildings on campus that we all had access to. And like we would just go in and like grab a bottle. And like you said, late night, like we're all, in the grad room, just like chugging wine, going out on the balcony and like smoking spliffs, you know what I mean? Like just really like just right there, just so deeply aligned, and pulling all nighters and like drinking through them, doing other substances to help with that, right? And then just the way those things kind of end up in this like cycle. So, you know.
Yeah, no, and let me say this. I do appreciate the professors that like paid for my cup of coffee or took me out to lunch when we were at conferences, and like sort of networking gatherings. But I like that you sort of brought this up, that like alcohol is a colonial commodity, and we could really talk all day long about transathleticism and like tools of domination. But like even this idea of like, it's like this like ritual of care that a professor who's tenured and who's situated more permanently within the institution is like normalizing, like, oh, I'll buy the first beer's on me, or I'll get the next
Yeah.
round, right? As this like, and it echoes this like long history of alcohol as this like colonizing tool, right? And it's really
Yeah.
exclusive. When I go to conferences, they're really sometimes they have recovery meetings, and it usually adheres to like the institution of AA, right? Like 12 step,
Yeah.
like they'll have 12 step meetings. Friends of Bill meetings is what they'll call it on the programs, or like any of the sort of conferences that I attend, like especially 4Cs, which is a national conference on composition
Hmm.
and communication. And I started to bring sober academics there because it was breaking away from like another hegemonic institution of AA, right? Because not everybody gets sober through AA. There's harm
Yeah.
reduction, there's other forms, non-abstinent, right? So,
Absolutely.
but we know that these places of networking that happen for academics center around that cultural norm of leisure. So,
Yeah.
and I'm really grateful that you brought that up, because you talked about collaboration, and it's hard to collaborate and to be seen as in the intellectual life as a queer sober academic when you're constantly asked to participate on this principle of exclusion, right?
Yeah.
And so, and it leads me to like the final question for today, and I want to thank you so much for like coming out. Like it was such a super great, and you and I could grab coffee. We could talk about this all day long. Right?
Oh
We do
yeah, for
another
sure.
another section.
We will. Yeah. No.
But yes, let's. But if you could imagine a future, if you could imagine a future of recovery in academia being fully queer farming, like what would that look like to you? Like how might institutions reimagine your success as a queer sober academic that
Mm,
prioritizes well-being? Like what does that actually look like for you?
yeah. Wow, that's a great question. Let me think. I think that, you know, um, having more of like a, I'm trying to think of the right word, but like, again, like just that fact that like if we're doing things interdisciplinarily or non-traditionally, um, that there, would be more space for that. But like, how does that happen? I guess is the question, right? I don't know, Danny. What do you think?
I mean, I was muted, but it made me laugh. I mean, I have to tell you, like, I don't know if we can. I mean, is it possible?
Right.
I don't. If we completely overturn if I could not education. No, no, no. We need the Department of Education. Let's not even go there. Okay? But if we completely overturn, like, I still think like the visibility of queer sober academics in the institution, in scholarship, while our voices are important for disrupting the dominant narrative, we're still so widely outnumbered because, we could talk about the white women of academia as well.
Hmm. Yeah.
The white cis women of academia,
Yeah.
how they maintain the patriarchal structure, but this is what we had to do to get what we needed to get. And like, listen, I'm not going to judge labor. I'm not going to judge exploitation, but we do need to have a conversation,
Yeah.
right? And to remind us about the sort of powers that be within the institutional walls. But I agree with you. I don't know. I mean, I think academia in and of itself has to entirely change,
Right. That's what I was going to
right?
say
Like,
too, right? It's like that. I mean, it's a sociological question of like how you can't change, like, you can't make gender just not matter to society anymore unless you are addressing like the institutional, structural, root bases of why the gender binary, is so entrenched in our society, right? Like, you can't change an institution that is meant to, take in people who already have privilege and spit them out with the title, that gets to kind of affirm that privilege and that myth of meritocracy. I mean, so many of the people in my program were people whose parents, were academics, right? Or like who had just like a lot of cultural capital that I did not possess. And yeah, I guess like yeah, there's just so many lessons, that people learn throughout their lives that kind of get them into that space. And like the university exists for a very specific purpose, right? I mean, in the first place, it was just meant to kind of do what we just said, and it's still doing the same thing. So yeah, I mean, you can't change like you can't change that aspect of it without changing everything about it, I think. So, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, which is why we're going to still continue the series of Queer Stories of Recovery, because
Yeah.
we know these issues are not going anywhere yet.
Yeah.
So, any final tips and suggestions for anybody who's been listening or watching today about how to like resist, you know, these issues, or how to work against these issues in academia at a personal level, but also one that is not exploitative?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think like I've existed in a lot of different institutions, you know, in life, and I think I have like one of my strengths is being able to kind of get into them and like fuck shit up a little bit, you know, like my neurodivergence allows me to kind of like see what's going on, um, and then see where I can kind of like, you know, fit in with a little bit of like a paradigm shift, or where I can maybe like, you know, trouble the water a little without it necessarily resulting in like, you know, full sanctions against me. I will say that like I don't have human children, and I don't have some of the things that would like make me perhaps a little bit more careful about some of what I do. Um, because like I don't like if I got I'm running the GSA here. I'm also running like the Women's Empower Club. The GSA is something that like not all of the people in administration on campus think should exist here, right? And I was just speaking to like the, you know, one full-time staff that I am kind of close with, and finding that person would be one of my pieces of advice. Um, and I was saying to her, you know, like if I was not asked back to teach here, and it was because this club was able to run and be visible, and I was able to be an out, you know, person in this position for everyone on this campus, like, okay, you know what I mean? Like, I personally am willing to take those kinds of risks, and like I refuse to be part of institutions in a very participatory way where I can't resist, honestly, you know. And that's gotten me in a lot of trouble in my life. And I do think, like I was saying at the beginning of this, that like through sobriety, I have just gotten a lot better at figuring out like how to do it. You know, I mean, Jersey, New York, Italian, right? Like people think I'm being aggressive out here when I'm not even remotely. But then also, like, if they knew me when I was drinking, like, yeah, I would fucking destroy you if you like said some ignorant shit. You know what I mean? Like, I would really just be like so like cutting, and you know, I mean, I'm not saying that I was wrong in my opinion, but I definitely, you know, didn't do it in a way that was like productive, um, or helpful. So, yeah, I think, you know, knowing your own position and what you're willing and capable, whether that's because of like financial or other privileges or reasons to do. Um, and then, yeah, like finding your people. And part of that, I think, is being out and open with students, you know, because the students are also my people. I mean, I'm a very non-hierarchical, you know, the end of my syllabus, like last few weeks, don't have readings on it. We come up with that together like halfway through the semester based on like what students want to learn more about. You know what I mean? So yeah, like trying to create a space that is non-hierarchical, and then as part of that, treating students, you know, with mutual respect and opening up with them. I mean, that's why two different students asked me to advise these clubs, you know, and now I'm able to kind of be in those spaces, and do a little bit more too. So, yeah, I think that just as we know from, you know, sociology and related fields, like everywhere that there's reproduction, there's also opportunity for resistance, right? Like sites of reproduction necessarily by definition also include resistance. Like they're, you know, they can't exist without one another, and just kind of like finding what works for you, you know, is
No, that was great, and that was well said. And I do think like, yeah, most of the people that are doing the work that I think students need are, many of them are contingent faculty members. I remember running a university-wide addiction recovery event.
mm,
You know, like, and I was the leading like faculty facilitator. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
or me and another fellow adjunct are creating a university-wide workshop about teaching tenured faculty how to make their classes more queer inclusive.
I love that.
Don't get me started. Right? I love it, but like, don't get me started. Yeah. But it's you're right. There is a level of care that needs to be practiced, because you can do what you can do and you can do what you want to do, but do know that there are risks and stakes involved. Yeah. And I'm glad that you shed light on that. Yeah. But before we close, thank you so much, Dee. I'm so excited that you were here. Maybe I'll get you back on, because I feel like there was so much more that we could talk about, and we can go on for days. Yeah. But before I close, I just want to remind everybody that recovery is not a one-size-fits-all journey. There are many paths, many practices, and many communities where healing and connection are possible. And a lot of that stuff is, you can see that, you can get that available today, not only on the web, but social media. There's telephone numbers and stuff within your local community as well. But if you are listening and you do need support, just so you know that help is out there. And September was National Recovery Month. I'm wearing my purple, right, like for recovery. So I just wanted this to be a reminder that you don't have to do it alone. So I'd love for you to stay connected with the Queer Stories of Recovery podcast. Each week on Wednesday nights, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time, Sober Academics has a meeting on Discord, and I'll actually share the flyer on the podcast. I'll also put it online as well. So if you are somebody who identifies as a sober academic, being queer is not a requisite, but if you are queer, like, hey, why not? If you're not, hey, why not? Everybody's welcome, right? Wherever you are on the journey, please definitely join us. And if you're interested in coming on the podcast and sharing your story, remember, it's your voice, your survival, and your joy that matters. So thank you, everyone, and I'm so glad to have you again. I hope everyone has a great day.
Yeah, thank you for your time. This was amazing.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Queer Stories of Recovery, Voices from the Margin podcast. On episode 3, Dr. Danny will be meeting with Hillary, a sober academic who has a few 24 hours, as they say in recovery, and who is currently a 76-year-old doctoral candidate in the Midwest working on trauma-informed writing studies and addiction rhetoric. And for those who are listening out there who are interested in attending the Sober Academics meeting, it meets weekly on Wednesdays at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Sober Academics is a peer-led recovery support group for individuals who practice some form of addiction recovery and who are seeking sober community in academia. So, if you identify as faculty, staff, admin, assistants, students, undergraduate, or graduate, PhD candidates, scholars, researchers, activists, artists, whatever, this meeting is for you. Sober Academics embraces the sharing of diversities in pathways, philosophies, methodologies, and practices of recovery. The group welcomes academics who practice abstention, harm reduction, and alternative considerations of and approaches to recovery. And Queer Stories of Recovery couldn't be more proud to support it. Stay tuned, more to be revealed.